Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Shaw.
Mrs. Willbrand, I missed you.
She's back. Hi. We're going to talk about we're going to continue to talk about, World War II, this time talking about the war effort on the home front, learning objective 5.3, describe the end of the war, and the impact the atomic bomb had on the world.
It's big stuff.
Let's do it.
All right, so American.
She's rusty.
I'm new here. Americans are going to join the military. So the Selective Service Act opens up the draft again. So after Pearl Harbor, about 5 million men volunteer for military service. 5 million men is not enough for a world war. So we open up the Selective Service Act, and it provides an additional 10 million soldiers. Military bases open around the country to put men through 8 intense weeks of basic training. We do expand the military to women as well. So we see the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, which allows women to serve in non-combat positions. And it becomes the Women's Army Corps in 1943, and they get full U.S. Army benefits in 43. And then we see a similar branch in the Air Force, the WASPs. These women fly non-combat missions, transporting supplies, moving aircrafts, and testing new planes.
One thing to remember, though, is that we are still in the height of discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
So FDR had ordered that there be no discrimination in government jobs. However, the military was still not desegregated at this time, unfortunately. All right, so speaking of discrimination, my goodness. Getting ahead of myself, I apologize. Again, there's a lot of minority groups that are fighting, and especially you're going to really see, especially Japanese Americans during this time are going to be really discriminated against. And even though one of the most successful ones helped America to actually win on D-Day, which we'll talk about later. But anyway, they were very frustrated because they're fighting for the country, but still being denied rights at home. This war, though, was really viewed as a way to fix that. So they thought that if they helped defeat Hitler and they helped defeat the Axis powers, that they would be granted more equal rights at home. So a lot of African Americans referred to this as the Double V campaign: victory against Hitler and victory against racism at home. And it's really just sad to think about how hard that must have been, to deal with so much racism and discrimination, but still be willing to go and fight for your country.
All right, so the federal government does step in and manage the war effort. We see this in all the wars. We saw this in World War I as well. So we have to win some American support because, again, nobody enjoys going to war. Nobody loves sending their husbands and brothers and fathers to war, knowing that they may not return. So you really have to get America on your side because it is all hands on deck kind of situation. So we see the Office of War Information, which is responsible for spreading propaganda to influence thoughts, feelings, and actions. You know this. You know what propaganda is from World War I. We talked about it. But what we do see is the film industry really stepping it up here and putting out movies and advertisement that really encourages Americans to be patriotic and put forth more effort into the war front. We see some economic controls as well. There's the Office of Pride Administration. It fights inflation because usually with war you're spending a lot of money, and so you do see some inflation. The War Production Board is going to decide which companies would transition to wartime production. Because we're going to have to move a whole bunch of raw materials, we're talking like rubber, steel, oil, to the war effort. And when you're shipping all that overseas, that's less for Americans at home. So we're going to have to figure out how to allocate those supplies and who's going to produce them and how much we need. And then we do see conservation of food and resources. So that's going to include rations, which is going to mean that you only get so much food of different things. So we're also going to see different days being allocated for different types of food. Say, hey, let's grow victory gardens again. We're going to see those. Meatless Mondays, so nobody eats meat on Mondays so that we have more meat to ship overseas to our soldiers. And then we do see, victory gardens. I already said it. I'm so sorry. Victory gardens.
And all this is really going to be seen as patriotic.
Yes.
Because just like it was in World War I, again, you are doing everything that you can to help us win. So the real other big thing that happens during this time is a mobilization of scientists. In the last 20 years since World War I, science had really made a lot of leaps and bounds. And in this particular one, though, we were kind of starting to use these scientific improvements and discoveries for the war effort. So things like radar, communication equipment, again, all of that now is going to help both sides, unfortunately. But again, the United States to be more successful, radar especially, is probably going to be one of the biggest ones for, or biggest inventions for submarines and then airplanes as well. There were also a lot of drugs that were used during this time, but things like penicillin that are going to be basically help soldiers that were, that would have died of infection. Now they have plenty of penicillin that is going to allow them to really probably survive and go home to their family when they wouldn't have before, even from minor injuries that we don't think are that bad, like that could be life-threatening before things like penicillin. Also, again, the elephant in the room here is the Manhattan Project. This is going to be what actually develops the atomic bomb. Robert Oppenheimer, Albert Einstein, again, all of these people that are working to develop the atomic bomb before Hitler scientists can, and that's going to be more relevant later.
All right, so let's talk production needs. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to really push production in America for the war effort. We saw this again back in World War I. So we're going to see companies really step it up for World War II as well. So the biggest problem here is that the U.S. is fighting on two fronts. So we have the war in Europe, but we also are fighting Japan since they since they bombed Pearl Harbor. So we're really kind of splitting our supplies here, which means that we're going to need even more to be able to send over, because they're not going to be able to, hey, we have enough, we're going to send it over here, because they're in two different places completely. So we see factories shift from peacetime to wartime production. So instead of making goods and products for home, we're going to see them making weapons and things for the military. We see 6 million women sign up and enter the workforce at this time, especially in factories. We see African Americans, Mexican Americans, Asian Americans, and Native Americans also join the workforce despite discrimination that they're facing at home. Again, even though they're being discriminated against, they still want to help their country. They're still being patriotic. They still want to be there for America. But America is not necessarily there for them. But we're going to see that play out a little bit more in the 50s and 60s.
And that usually happens in wartime. Like we'll talk about the government restricting your rights during times of great distress for the country, and that is seen as acceptable. That has been ruled as acceptable by the Supreme Court. So the thing we're not going to talk about quite yet, but we're going to talk more about in class, is the internment of Japanese Americans. So after the attack on Pearl Harbor, what you need to know is that millions and millions of American citizens that happened to be of Japanese ancestry were essentially shipped to these camps and kept there for the remainder of the war. This was seen at the time as a huge violation of rights. We had never really seen this before with American citizens on this scale. So that's what I always tell my kids, like, these are American citizens just like you and I that have rights, the right to the property rights especially, that were essentially taken from them. And then after the war, when they're released, all of their property is gone, their homes are going to be gone, and they're going to have to start over. So we're going to talk a lot more about that in class, watch a couple videos and things like that. But I just wanted to let you know what that was, and we're going to cover that much more in depth in class. Yeah. Anything to add?
Just a lot of them were not even immigrants at one time. A lot of them were natural-born U.S. citizens, and were born here, and still put in these camps. So
yeah, the same thing actually happened with a lot of German immigrants or people of German ancestry. Mm-hmm. But that was the Japanese American internment happened on the West Coast, like in California, places like that, and they were shipped as far as like Arkansas sometimes for these camps. But there was something similar happened with German or people of German ancestry, but it wasn't on such a mass scale.
Well,
but still,
Germans look very, very similar to just everyday white Americans. So It's easier to pick out somebody of Japanese descent.
Yeah.
So
that's true. Okay, so we're going to talk about the war next, and this is not going to do it nearly enough justice.
Nope.
But we wanted to make sure that you at least had it, so you knew basically what actually happened during the war. But after this, we'll get into the end of the war and kind of the implications of that.
Okay.
Do you want me to start? I
You
feel like
Go
you've been
ahead.
talking a lot.
Go ahead.
Like just because you've got bigger slides. I'm so sorry.
Oh, I just miss them so much. I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, they've been hearing a lot of me lately. All right, so anyway, war in Europe. So FDR and Churchill, again, Winston Churchill has taken over for Chamberlain?
Mm-hmm.
Chamberlain.
Yep.
I can't remember his first name. I want to say Wilt, but that's a basketball player.
Is it Neville?
Neville Chamberlain. Nice job. Anyway, so Churchill's taken over now as Prime Minister of Great Britain. FDR is still president, going on his third term now. And actually, might be... Yeah, he's like, I think right in the middle of his third term.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway...
Still allowed.
It's still allowed, not after FDR.
Not
But
until
anyway,
51.
they decided that Hitler was the greatest threat, so they wanted to focus on Europe first. So basically, we're in just kind of a holding pattern against the Japanese until we can deal more with the war in Europe. So they actually decided to strike through Italy first because Italy was seen as the weakest of the Axis powers. So you see this North African front where Dwight Eisenhower, future president, is going to take control, and they're going to, and I'll just use my mouse here, just, you see where they start up here, they're going to go all the way through Northern Europe, or Northern Africa rather, and then up through the boot heel of Italy, and then that's going to be kind of one way to access the war in Europe so that they can kind of try to pincer Germany from two sides. Again, they are going to be successful. They push Italian troops out and then out of Africa, and then they plan to attack Italy. The Italian campaign went well. Mussolini actually ended up having to be he was forced to resign and then killed. That was not related to the war itself. Like the American troops or the Allied troops didn't do that. That just happened kind of on their own. Italians were essentially sick of Mussolini, and they decided to just do that himself. He was executed. They left his body in the square for a week for people to just spit on and beat. It was a horrible again, he did really horrible things, but again, the Italians got their revenge on him. So that was the kind of the main start of the war in Europe, and then the fall of Italy.
All right, so that brings us to D-Day. Operation Overlord was the invasion of Normandy. 3 million British, American, and Canadian troops stormed Normandy beaches. They tricked They tricked Germany into thinking the attack was somewhere else. So that it kind of opened up this opportunity for them to storm these beaches and make it into Europe. And this is in France, Normandy, France. D-Day was set for June 6th of 1944. There were a whole lot of casualties, but it was a really successful invasion of Europe.
It was a really well-fortified area, and basically Hitler knew that. He knew that this was the only way that the Allied troops were going to be able to get into France. Remember that France was essentially knocked out of the war really early, and so
France. Always true.
What are you going to do? Then he just fortified the beaches of Normandy because this was the main access point for Great Britain, and then they just basically had all the Allied troops knew what was coming. They knew what they had to do. And they did it anyway. So, again, the Battle of the Bulge was actually the last battle. After D-Day, Hitler really kind of knew that his chances were kind of starting to shrink a little bit, just because now with Americans involved and the entire force of American industry behind the Allies, it was going to be hard to really keep up the fight. Also, the Soviet Union had joined as well, but that was much earlier, and they had been fighting. They had been fighting for a while, but you never invade Russia in the winter. It's stupid.
Poor choice.
Napoleon tried to do it too. It can't be done.
History repeats itself. You should learn from that.
It does. So anyway, the Battle of the Bulge was his last push to really do some damage and pretty much break the Allied lines. And this was really it. Again, this was over a couple weeks, actually. They fought in the bitter winter in January of, I believe it was 1945. And after he lost here, it was essentially over. And he had to retreat back into Germany. And then we'll see him eventually take his own life. And then the Germans surrendered after that. And war is pretty much over in Europe.
All right, so that helps us turn to the war in the Pacific. So the United States does start slow. We lose in the Philippines. We see Japan force the capture of the United States soldiers. Bataan?
Bataan, yeah.
I don't know why I try to pronounce it wrong every time.
Bataan? I think either. I mean,
It's
either
Bataan.
one's fine.
If you know, come tell us. Okay,
Not
anyway.
right now. You're busy.
Not right now. So they do force the soldiers to walk across the Bataan Peninsula. That sounds right. Thousands of them do die, so high casualties there. After the Bataan Death March, the U.S. Begins to gain momentum in the Pacific, especially with the Battle of Midway. This is a huge turning point for the U.S. because it is a victory, and it helps us gain some footing in the Pacific. And
remember that the entire U.S. like at Pearl Harbor, Japan wanted to knock out our entire Pacific fleet, but they couldn't because a lot of them had gone away on a training exercise that day. So we just needed to kind of and there's so many islands in the Pacific that Japan had control of. So we needed to just kind of start working our way towards the Japanese mainland, and that leads us to our strategy of island hopping. So this is, again, we're basically hopping from island to island. Historians are great at naming things. So anyway, remember that all of this territory is really going to be under the control of the Japanese. So starting from Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and just really trying to move out as much as we can, again, trying to get as close to the Japanese mainland as possible. Iwo Jima and Okinawa are the two islands that are closest to Japan, at least that were fortified by the Japanese. The U.S. was able to take them, but we lost a lot of lives. Again, all of the things that are normal in war, things like jungle fever, just all kinds of things are going to be, the troops are going to have to deal with anyway. It's going to be really tough. But also, the Japanese fought ferociously for each island, and this is going to lead us into why we even decided to use the atomic bomb, because the Japanese really weren't going to surrender. There wasn't anything that wasn't really even in their vocabulary how to do that. So
and remember, they're a military-led state under General Tojo too, so their whole focus is military and building a strong military in preparation of this war.
All right, let's finish up.
Let's go.
End of World War II.
All right, so the Allies liberate Europe. Liberation of death camps starts in July of 1944. Soviets come upon the Nazi death camps. As Allied troops crossed into German territory, they're horrified by the sights they saw. We knew that some of this was happening, but we had no idea the extent of it. And so as these death camps are discovered by Allied troops, they're horrible sights. The things that are happening to the people there are just awful. And so we jump right in and liberate these death camps because it's awful.
Again, and this was probably by far the worst atrocity that the world had ever seen. You're talking 6 million Jews died. It wasn't just Jews, though. They targeted basically anybody that didn't fit, the specific German profile that Hitler liked. The thing that really stinks for us is that we just don't have a lot of time to talk about it and to get into it. You guys should have more of that time, in next year in world history, but also
in English.
And in English, they take a lot of time and they talk about it just because, like I said, this is something that we need to know about, and we need to know so that it doesn't happen again. All right, so this brings us to the Yalta Conference, and you see that this is, again, kind of a big three sort of situation here. We have Churchill on the left, FDR in the middle, and then Stalin on the right. So, as I said, FDR was elected again in 1944, so this is term number 4 for him. He's not going to survive this one, though. And then in 1945, this was in February, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met in Yalta to discuss the fate of Germany and the post-war world. Again, we remember what happened in Versailles. And again, we don't want this to happen. And so they're trying to figure out, how is this going to work? How can we make sure to establish a long-term peace? The biggest thing they decided was that they were going to divide Germany into 4 zones of occupation, and each of the Allied powers was going to control one. So we're going to have again U.S., Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Now, again, remember that the Soviet Union is communist and very, like pretty much kind of like the antithesis to United States capitalism and things like that. So while we are fighting together now as allies, once we don't have a common enemy anymore, we're going to kind of start to see the Red Scare kind of come back, and people are going to be afraid of communism again, and we're not going to really we're going to really try to keep Stalin and the communists from obtaining too much power in Germany, because again, we don't want Germany to become communist themselves.
My kids and I talked about this when we were taking our book notes over Stalin. Remember, he is a little unstable, and not even a little, he's a lot unstable. And really unpredictable, and, he's real power hungry, as any good dictator is. And so dividing Germany and giving him a portion of it, we do run the risk because he is communist and the other three are capitalist nations. So we're going to see that economic battle start as we move into the Cold War.
Stalin himself, though, is really, Hitler usually gets the title of, worst human being of all time. But to be honest with you, Stalin, as far as even body count goes, and I hate to put it in such crass terms, but like they don't even know. They don't even know how many people he had killed throughout his 20-something year reign. People think it was in the 100 millions. And so there's a lot of, he's definitely a bad guy, but he did help us defeat Hitler. And so now we just have to deal with the repercussions of that.
All right. So we're going to talk about the unconditional surrender. The Allies do not accept anything other than unconditional surrender. So on April 30th, 1945, Hitler and his wife, they kill themselves, and their bodies are burned in a fire. On May 8th of 1945, General Eisenhower, who later becomes president, accepts the unconditional surrender of the Third Reich with VE Day, which is Victory in Europe.
So again, FDR dies on April 12th, 1945, just about 3 months into his fourth term. So his vice president, Harry Truman, becomes president, the only president from Missouri, Independence, Yay! Missouri.
It's over by Kansas City.
Way to go. Again, and Truman now is going to have to take over, and he's going to actually be in charge of this, of finishing the war. And Truman is not, he's a good politician, but again, he doesn't really have, like FDR was Joseph Stalin respected FDR. Like, that's really all you need to know. Like, and so once Truman takes over, though, he's not going to have that respect, and it's going to be a lot harder for him to he doesn't really have the negotiating power and the prestige that FDR does. So that's going to be a really tough, battle for him or hill for him to climb, so to speak.
Think of what he comes into. This. Yeah. He comes into this. Which brings us to the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb. So it's the best kept secret in the war. People didn't really know about the atomic bomb, didn't really know that it was being built at the time. It was developed and tested. Truman had to really weigh the options. Should the bomb be used to end the war? Like, it could end the war swiftly, but we risk killing millions of people that are innocent and wanted no part of this. And so Truman comes into the presidency, and this is on his plate. And so he really has to weigh those options and decide, is this the right thing to do? And it looks like there is a link there to the Manhattan Project. So I would go ahead and check that out when you have some time, because the PowerPoint is posted. So make sure you go in and click that link and learn a little bit more about the Manhattan Project. And we'll talk a little bit more in class about testing the atomic bombs as well. So.
And again, like this is going to be probably the toughest decision that any president has had to make. And again, I don't want to give it away because I want you guys to form your own opinions about this. But we have kind of talked about in general the breakdown of what you could how you could approach it. But again, there are other ways to go about it as well. We'll talk about that more in class. All right, so Truman does decide to use the atomic bomb. He drops the first one on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Again, that was August 6, 1945. The bomb was named Little Boy. It's dropped over Hiroshima, which was an important Japanese military center. And again, they waited then 3 days. Japan did not surrender. Now, again, the thing I need to tell you, though, is that Japan didn't even have a word for surrender. Like, they didn't know, like, what to do. Like, they would never have even thought about surrendering. And so they're like, basically, Hideki Tojo was still in charge as the quote-unquote prime minister. He was essentially just the dictator. The emperor of Japan basically had to get rid of him. He had to decide that it was better to save Japanese lives and figure out how to end this war without any more atomic bombs being dropped. But again, those 3 days were not enough for him to do that. So again, they dropped another atomic bomb on August 9th, and that was nicknamed Fat Man, dropped on Nagasaki. Nagasaki was mostly just civilians. There was really no importance to the war, anything that can really be like justified as far as that goes. So that was kind of a tough one. But you see, it takes them almost a month to issue their surrender. On September 2nd, though, the Japanese do surrender, again, unconditionally, and then we'll see kind of the implications of that.
And just so that you know, Truman tells them before Little Boy is dropped, if you don't surrender, this is going to happen. They don't surrender. They didn't know the word for it. We drop Little Boy. We say it again. If you surrender, then we're good. But if not, like, this is going to happen again. They don't surrender, and they don't tell their citizens to evacuate Nagasaki. Nobody's told. The people aren't told.
And
just the military knows.
And I don't know specifically that they knew where the second bomb was coming. Like, he didn't tell them where it would be coming. And again, you're talking about like tens of hundreds of thousands of people that are dying. Like, not even just in the initial blast, you're talking about people getting sick from radiation poisoning. Again, these cities are still radioactive, today. And again, that's not the kind of thing that Truman would have even known about. So it's hard to judge him from that lens. But again, it's something that we know now, and it's easier for us to kind of look back and be like, man, like, that's crazy. But the idea here is Truman's trying to end this war as fast as possible. He knows that a ground invasion is going to take many, many American lives, and he wants to do what he can to save those American lives.
I was just going to say, we're going to look at some pictures of Little Boy and Fat Man. The reason they have really different names is because they're really different types of bombs, and we'll talk about that in class.
Okay, so... was this you?
Go ahead.
Okay,
so... You're having a good time.
I am having a... This is so nice. Again, the idea you see is at peace ? The thing that you need to understand is that they said, hey, League of Nations didn't work. So we're going to establish a new one called the United Nations that is going to be an international peacekeeping organization, again, based on the equality of nations, and it does a lot of good work. Even today, it's actually based in New York City. And I didn't know. Did you know that the United Nations and the WHO or the World Health Organization as a basis of the United Nations determines vaccines, like which flu vaccine to issue?
That's interesting.
Isn't that interesting? I thought so. Anyway, again, the goal is to maintain peace and security. And so this one is going to be more successful. Obviously, we've seen conflict, but we have not seen another world war on the scale that we saw with World War I and II. So by that regard, it is successful. Potsdam Conference takes over. Again, this is Truman's first conference. Now he is going to be negotiating on behalf of the United States. They officially divide Germany. Each occupying country is going to take reparations from their zone. Berlin was also divided up into 4 zones. That's going to become relevant. We'll talk about that more in class.
It's the capital of Germany, where all of their big factories in the heart of their economic system is. And that's why they're going to divide the city of Berlin.
Perfect. We'll talk about that a lot more later, too. This leads us to the Nuremberg trials. Again, the Holocaust is atrocious. We're talking about the worst event that we've ever seen in human history, and we have to hold people accountable. Hitler was obviously the brainchild behind this. He was the one that started everything, but there were people that followed him, and this was really the place where they determined that if you follow a bad order, then you are also going to be held accountable for that. I don't know what's happening. Does it see?
Might be a little frozen.
I'm not sure. Well, we're just going to continue then because it looks like it's still recording. Again, so these trials these are the Allied trials of Nazi leaders. They were charged with crimes against peace, with war crimes, and then crimes against humanity. A lot of them were found guilty and then executed for that. Also, Japan was occupied by the United States for 7 years, and we wanted one of the other reasons why we wanted to use the atomic bomb is so that they would surrender to us rather than the Soviet Union. And we actually have a really good relationship now with Japan. 80 years later, because we helped them to really rebuild and become, I don't want to say like become like us, but like
we turn all of their factories that had focused for so long on just military production into economic giants, essentially,
yeah.
where they're mass producing things for not just Japan but the whole world for trade, and so that helps them become larger in the world as a power,
sure.
Because money's everything.
It is. Guys, that's it.
We made it.
Hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you in the next one. Welcome back, Miss Willbrand. Good to have you.
Good to be here, guys. See you later.
See ya.